Hey, new guy, stand up and let everyone see what a loser looks like. Travis Boone's voice carried across the yard at Iron Ridge Correctional, and dozens of inmates erupted in laughter. Ryan Walker rose slowly, jaw tight, saying nothing, while a guard glanced over and turned away, bored, as if humiliation here was just weather. Nobody in that yard knew the man being mocked had once been an undefeated boxing champion who could end a fight in seconds. Yet Ryan only lowered his head. Why would a fighter like him choose to bow before a bully? The man they were laughing at had a name that meant nothing inside Iron Ridge, and that was exactly how Ryan Walker wanted it. He stood there until Travis Boone lost interest, then sat back down on the cold bench and folded his hands. For 38 years he had carried himself like a man who knew his own size, and the worst part of prison so far was learning to make himself small on purpose. Years ago, before the steel doors, Ryan had been something else entirely. He had fought his way up through gyms that smelled of sweat and liniment, and by the time he hung up his gloves, his record was nearly flawless. People who followed the sport remembered the way he ended things fast and clean, almost gentle in how little he wasted. Then he walked away from all of it, traded the ring for ordinary work and ordinary hours, because the thing he wanted most was a quiet life he could come home to. That quiet life was gone now, taken from him by a case that never should have stuck. A shipment had gone missing at the warehouse where he worked. Money had moved through accounts he never touched, and when the paperwork landed, it landed on him. A manager named Dale Foster, smooth and well-liked, had pointed a careful finger, and the documents seemed to agree. Ryan had no money for the kind of lawyer who could fight smoke, and the jury saw a big, quiet man who looked like he could hurt someone. They gave him years for a crime that belonged to another man. He remembered the moment the verdict came down, the way the room tilted and then steadied. He had promised himself one thing on the bus ride to Iron Ridge, watching the fences roll past the window. He would not use his hands in here. Not once. One act of violence behind these walls, and his sentence would stretch, his appeal would die, and whatever slim chance he had of walking out a free man would close like a fist. So he kept his head down and his record clean, and he counted the weeks like a man counting his own heartbeats. There was an appeal moving somewhere out in the world, slow as cold honey handled by a public defender's office, that had handed his file to a woman named Claire Bennett. He had met her once across a scarred table in the visitation room, and she had told him the case had holes if anyone bothered to look. He held on to that sentence the way a drowning man holds a rope he cannot see the end of. Iron Ridge had its own laws, older and meaner than anything written down, and at the center of those laws sat Travis Boone. Travis was not the biggest man in the block, but he was the one everyone watched the way you watch a dog that is already bitten. He ran the yard through a handful of followers and a long memory for grudges, and he chose new men, carefully testing them the way a buyer tests fruit, pressing to see what gave. The day Ryan arrived, Travis pressed. He started small with the comments in the yard, the loud questions about whether the new man could even talk. When Ryan gave him nothing, Travis took it as an invitation rather than a wall. By the end of the first week, he had decided the quiet newcomer would be his entertainment, and Travis was a man who liked his entertainment regular. It began with the food. In the chow line, Travis would drift up beside Ryan, lift the tray out of his hands, and pass it down the line to one of his men, daring Ryan to reach for it. Ryan let his arms hang loose and went hungry more nights than he could afford to. He told himself that hunger was a price, and prices could be paid, and a man who paid them quietly was a man still walking toward the gate. Then it was the bunk. He would come back from work detail to find his thin mattress dragged onto the floor, the frame bent just enough to dig into his back through the night. Once he found the whole thing soaked water pooling in the seams, and he lay awake on the damp cot listening to Travis's men snicker in the dark. He said nothing. He fixed what he could fix and ignored the rest. And in the morning his eyes were red, but his manner was unchanged. The letters were worse because the letters were the one thing that mattered. Mail came twice a week, and twice a week Travis or one of his crew would intercept it before it reached Ryan, reading the envelopes aloud in a mocking sing-song before tearing them up or simply walking off with them. There were letters in there about his appeal pages from Claire Bennett that he needed to see, and watching them disappear was like watching pieces of his own future torn into confetti. Still, he gave them nothing. The guard assigned to that block was a heavy-set man named Owen Briggs, and Owen had a particular gift for looking the other way at exactly the right moment. He had worked Iron Ridge for nearly 20 years, and somewhere in those years, he had come to an understanding with Travis Boone, the kind of understanding that was never spoken, but always honored. Travis kept the block quiet in the ways that mattered to the administration, and in return, Owen let Travis keep it loud in the ways that mattered to Travis. So when the tray came out of Ryan's hands, Owen studied the far wall. When the bunk got flipped, Owen was somewhere else entirely. And when a letter got torn up in the open yard, Owen's eyes slid over the whole scene, like water over glass, and found nothing worth a report. Ryan understood the arrangement within days. There would be no help from the uniform. The man in the uniform was part of the machine that was grinding him down. The other inmates learned the rules fast the way men in cages always do. They learned that the new man could be pushed, that pushing him cost nothing, and that laughing along with Travis was safer than the alternative. Within 2 weeks, Ryan Walker had a reputation, and the reputation was simple and brutal. He was the coward in cell 41. He was the big man with no spine. He was the joke that never got old. There was one man who did not laugh. He was older gray at the temples, with the careful stillness of someone who had survived a long time inside by watching more than he spoke. His name was Marcus Hale, and he had a top bunk 2 cells down and a habit of reading the same worn paperbacks over and over. He watched Ryan take his beatings of pride in silence, and something in the way Ryan moved snagged at his memory like a thorn. It took Marcus the better part of a month to place it. He cornered Ryan one afternoon in the narrow shadow of the laundry, keeping his voice low the way men do when the wrong word can travel. "I know you," Marcus said. "Took me a while. The footwork gave it away. You used to fight. Not bar fight. The real thing. You were a champion." Ryan's face stayed flat, but something moved behind his eyes. "That was another life," he said. "Leave it there." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Doesn't matter what life it was. Boone doesn't stop. I've watched him work 20 men since I got here. He only stops when something stops him, and nothing in this block is going to do that for you. You keep folding, he keeps pressing, and one day pressing turns into something you don't walk away from." "I walk away from all of it," Ryan answered. "That's the whole point. I keep my hands down, I keep my record clean, I get my appeal heard, and I walk out the front gate a free man. The second I hit somebody, that gate closes. They add years. They bury the appeal. Everything I've got left dies on the floor of this place." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and there was something almost like pity in the old man's face. "You think the gate's still open?" he said quietly. "I'm telling you, son, Boone's going to close it for you, whether you throw a punch or not. A man who won't defend himself in here isn't surviving. He's just dying slow and calling it patience." The words sat in Ryan's chest long after Marcus walked away. He lay on his damp bunk that night and turned them over and over. He had built his whole strategy on a single belief that if he simply absorbed enough, endured enough, gave them nothing to use against him, the system would eventually do right by him. Claire Bennett would find the holes in the case. The appeal would move. The truth about Dale Foster and the missing shipment would surface, and he would walk out clean. All he had to do was last. But Marcus had seen something Ryan did not want to see. There was a difference between enduring and disappearing, and Ryan was no longer sure which side of that line he stood on. Every day he gave Travis a little more, and every day there seemed to be a little less of Ryan Walker left to give. The food, the bunk, the letters, the laughter. Each surrender was supposed to buy him distance from violence, and instead, it only seemed to invite more. He thought about his hands, then really thought about them the way he had trained them not to think, but to know. 20 years of muscle and instinct lived in those hands, the kind of knowledge that did not leave a man even when he wished it would. He could end any one of Travis's crew in the space of a breath. He knew it the way he knew his own name. And that certainty was exactly what terrified him, because the moment he used it, he became the man the jury had already decided he was. Big, dangerous, guilty. That was the trap, and Travis Boone had built it without even knowing the shape of it. If Ryan fought back, he proved them all right, and lost his freedom forever. If he did not fight back, he might lose something worse, slowly piece by piece, until there was nothing left to free. 2 doors, and behind both of them stood a man he did not want to be. The harassment did not pause to let him decide. The morning after his talk with Marcus, Travis found a new game. He waited until the yard was full, then walked up to where Ryan sat and stood over him, blocking the sun. "On your feet, 41, he said loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "I want everybody to see how a real man takes orders." Ryan stood. He always stood because not standing was its own kind of fight, and he could not afford even that. Travis circled him slowly, talking the whole time, working the crowd, calling him names that landed like small stones. The other inmates laughed, because laughing was safe, and Owen Briggs leaned against the far fence with his thumbs in his belt and watched the clouds. Ryan kept his eyes forward and his arms loose, and inside his chest, the question Marcus had planted grew louder than the laughter. He had told himself this was patience. Standing here swallowing this was supposed to be the disciplined choice. The smart choice, the choice that led to the gate. But standing in the center of that circle with 60 men laughing at him, he felt the truth of the old man's warning settle into his bones. This was not patience. This was a man being slowly erased and calling it survival. When Travis finally lost interest and walked off, Ryan sat back down. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of holding them still. He pressed them flat against his thighs until they stopped. Across the yard, Marcus caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of his head, a gesture that said everything the old man had already said out loud. "You can't keep doing this." That night, Ryan did not sleep. He stared at the underside of the bunk above him and walked the whole thing through slow and honest, the way he used to study an opponent before a fight. He had come into Iron Ridge with one rule, and the rule had been a good one, built on cold logic. No violence. Protect the appeal. Walk out free. But the logic only worked if the world on the other side of the bars played fair, and the world in here did not play at all. It just took. There was a point coming. He understood now, a line that Travis would eventually cross, where the choice would no longer be between freedom and pride. It would be between his life and his death. And when that moment came, the rule he had built his whole survival on would shatter, because no rule was worth more than the man it was meant to protect. He did not want that moment to come. He prayed in his flat, tired way that it would not. But he had stopped believing he could prevent it. He turned onto his side and looked at the gray rectangle of light from the corridor, and he made a quieter promise to himself than the first one, a promise with no certainty in it at all. He would hold the line as long as he could. He would give Travis everything that did not cost him his life or his last shred of self. He would wait for Claire Bennett and the appeal and the slow machinery of a truth he could not see. And if the day ever came when there was no choice left, when it was use his hands or stop breathing, then he would have to become for a few terrible seconds the man he had spent his whole life learning to control. It was not the clean strategy he had walked in with. It was something worse and more honest, a man bracing for a thing he could not avoid. Somewhere out beyond the fences, his appeal sat in a folder on a desk, and Claire Bennett was reading the case that should never have convicted him. Inside these walls, Travis Boone was already deciding what game to play tomorrow, and Ryan Walker lay awake between those two facts, a champion pretending to be a coward, waiting to find out which one of them he would be forced to become. The first gray light came through the high window before he closed his eyes. When the doors rolled open for morning count, he stood at his bars, like every other man, face blank, manner unbroken. Travis passed by his cell and smirked, and Ryan looked through him as if he were glass. The choice was still ahead of him, unmade, and he carried it into the day like a stone in his chest, knowing that with each hour, Travis pushed the day he dreaded, came closer, and the door to his old life inched a little further shut. The days that followed taught Ryan that a man who refuses to fight only sharpens the appetite of the man hunting him. Travis Boone took Ryan's silence as a kind of permission, and each morning he arrived with something new. The games grew bolder because nothing pushed back, and a bully without resistance is a fire, without a wall spreading wherever it pleases. Travis stopped working alone. He sent his crew at Ryan in shifts, now a deliberate rotation designed to wear at the edges of a man until the edges gave. One would shoulder into him in the corridor hard enough to slam him against the cinder block. Another would flick food at the back of his neck in the chow hall. A third would stand inches from his face during count breathing on him, whispering filth, daring him with every word to lift a hand. Ryan understood the design even as it ground against him. They were not trying to beat him. They were trying to make him swing first because the first swing was the thing that mattered. If Ryan threw the opening punch, every story that followed would call him the aggressor, and the truth of who started it would vanish under 100 willing lies. So he held. He let himself be shoved and spat on and crowded, and he kept his arms down until his shoulders ached from the discipline of stillness. His body was paying for it. He slept badly on a bunk they flipped most nights, and he ate whatever made it past Travis's hands, which was never enough. The constant readiness the muscles always braced for a blow that might or might not come drained him in a way no fight ever had. A fight had a beginning and an end. This had neither. This was a slow bleed, and he was the only one in the block who could see how much he had already lost. Marcus Hale watched it happen from his corner and said nothing more because he had already said it all. The old man's silence was its own kind of pressure. Every time their eyes met across the yard, Ryan read the same sentence he had read a dozen times. "You are dying slow," and calling it patience. And every time Ryan looked away because the alternative was a door he still could not bring himself to open. To the rest of Iron Ridge, the verdict was long settled. Ryan Walker was the coward of Cell 41, the big man with no nerve, and his cowardice had become a fixed feature of the block, as ordinary as the bars and the bad food. New men learned his name as a punchline before they learned it as a name. He felt himself shrinking inside that reputation until it fit him like a second skin. And the worst part was how easy it would have been to believe it himself. Owen Briggs kept up his end of the arrangement with a craftsman's care. He had a sense for exactly when to be absent, drifting toward the far end of the block whenever Travis decided to perform. Once Ryan caught the guard's eye in the middle of a shoving match, held it for a full second, and saw nothing there at all. Not cruelty, not guilt, just the flat boredom of a man watching a process he had seen run 100 times. Owen turned and walked, and Ryan understood that the uniform was not neutral. It was on Travis's side, and it always had been. Then came the day Travis stopped playing for laughs and started playing for blood. It began as a whisper passed through the crew, a plan built around the one blind spot every man in the block knew about. The shower room at the far end of the wing had a camera that had been broken for months, a dead black eye that the administration kept promising to fix and never did. It was the one place in Iron Ridge where a thing could happen with no record of it happening. Travis arranged it carefully the way he arranged everything. He had one of his men spread word that a package had come in for Ryan, a small favor, a peace offering left in the shower room. It was a clumsy lie, and part of Ryan suspected what waited on the other side of that door. But there was no version of this he could refuse. If he stayed out of the shower room, Travis would simply move the trap somewhere else, or send the crew to drag him in when he was not watching. Walking in on his own feet was the only piece of control left to him, and he took it, because a man who chooses his ground at least gets to stand on it. The room was empty when he stepped inside, the tile slick and the air thick with old steam. Then the door swung shut behind him, and the bolt slid home. 4 of them peeled away from the walls where they had been waiting, Travis's most loyal, the ones who did the things Travis wanted done. A 5th man, crouched in the corner, with a contraband phone already raised, the small black rectangle pointed at Ryan like a second weapon. This was the part Travis cared about most. Not just the beating, the recording of it, a trophy he could pass around the block. Smile 41. Travis said from the doorway, arms folded content to watch his work performed by other hands. "We're gonna make you famous. The whole block's gonna see the coward cry." The 4 moved in a loose circle the way men move when they have done this before and know there is no rush. Ryan stood in the center with his back to the wet wall, and the fear in him went quiet, replaced by the still focus he used to feel in the seconds before a bell. The ground beneath his choice had finally fallen away, and there was only one place left to stand. He had walked into Iron Ridge with a rule, and the rule had been built for a world with lines in it. No violence. Protect the appeal. Walk out free. But the rule assumed that the worst thing waiting for him was more years, and the 4 men closing in had just changed the math. This was no longer a question of his sentence. Locked in a room with a dead camera and 5 men who wanted him broken, this had become a question of whether he walked out at all. The first one came in fast, swinging wide for Ryan's head, the kind of telegraphed haymaker that 20 years ago Ryan would have slipped in his sleep. The whole world narrowed and slowed, the way it always had, when the bell rang, and the part of him he had buried under a month of swallowed pride rose up clean and certain. The rule was gone. It had served its purpose and brought him to the end of itself, and on the other side of it stood the only man who could get him out of that room alive. Ryan moved. He slipped the first punch by an inch and put a single short hook into the man's body just under the ribs, and the man folded around it with a sound like all the air leaving a tire. It was precise rather than wild, a placed shot, the work of a craftsman and not a brawler. The man went down to one knee and stayed there, no longer part of the fight. The second one was already coming, and Ryan turned into him, catching the reaching arm and answering with a clean, straight shot that snapped the man's head back and dropped him to the wet tile. There was no rage in it. That was the thing the crew would never understand, the thing that separated Ryan Walker from every yard fighter in Iron Ridge. He was not losing control. He was using it. Every motion was measured, calibrated to do exactly enough and no more. The 3rd and 4th came together, thinking numbers would matter, and against any other man they might have. Ryan stepped between them, rather than back, breaking the angle so they could not both reach him at once. He took a glancing blow off his shoulder and ignored it, pivoted and put one of them down with a short hook to the jaw, the same economical violence as before. The last one got a half-second to understand what was happening to him before Ryan's hand closed the distance and ended it. The whole thing took perhaps 10 seconds. 5 men had walked into that room certain of how it would go, and 4 of them were now on the floor, dropped not with cruelty, but with the surgical brevity of a man who knew precisely how much force a body could take and refused to exceed it. The 5th, the one with the phone, stood frozen in the corner, the camera still running, capturing a thing entirely different from what it had been brought to record. Travis Boone's face had gone slack in the doorway. The script he had written had flipped on him in the space of a breath, and for the first time since Ryan arrived at Iron Ridge, the most dangerous man in the block looked like he did not understand the room he was standing in. Ryan did not advance on him. That was the part that would haunt Travis later, the part that made it worse. The big, quiet man simply stood among the four he had dropped and let the moment hang. Then he did something none of them expected. He crouched beside the first man, the one curled around his ribs, and checked him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck, tilting his head to look at his eyes. "You'll live," Ryan said quietly. "Breathe slow. It'll ease up." He moved to the next and did the same. And the next, a champion, checking the men who had come to break him to make sure he had not broken them past repair. There was no triumph in it. There was something almost like sorrow, the heavy knowledge of a man who had spent his whole life learning to be careful with a thing that could kill, and who had just been forced to take it out of the box he kept it in. The man with the phone bolted the moment the bolt was thrown back, and Ryan let him go. He walked out of the shower room and back into the block, and the hush that followed him was a new kind of hush. Word of what had happened in the broken camera room moved through Iron Ridge faster than any official report, and by nightfall, every man in the wing looked at Cell 41 differently. The coward was a story that had died in 10 seconds, and nobody yet knew what story would take its place. What none of them knew, not Ryan, not even Travis, was that the phone had kept recording, and the man who fled had every intention of using it. He had filmed the beating to humiliate Ryan, and now that the beating had gone wrong, he made a different calculation entirely. He believed he had something valuable. He tried to sell the clip to other inmates as a curiosity, a video of the new man wrecking 4 of Boone's crew, and in passing it from hand to hand, he lost control of it completely. Within 2 days, a copy rode out of Iron Ridge on a smuggled signal beyond the reach of anyone who might have wanted it, buried and landed, where everything lands now, in the open in front of the whole world. The video spread fast. It showed a locked room, 4 men closing on one, and that one ending the threat in seconds, with a control that anyone could see was not ordinary. People who knew the sport recognized the footwork the way Marcus had recognized it, and a name surfaced, and the name was Ryan Walker, the champion who had vanished from the public eye and turned up of all places in a prison shower room, dismantling 4 attackers without losing his head. The reaction split down the middle the way these things always do. Half the people who saw it called him a hero, a wronged man defending his life with breathtaking restraint, a fighter who could have crippled his attackers and chose instead to check their pulses. The other half saw only a convicted criminal, a violent man doing violent things, and asked what else you would expect from someone already behind bars. 2 crowds watched the same 10 seconds and saw 2 different men, and both of them were loud. Inside Iron Ridge, the administration saw only one thing: a problem. The footage that should never have existed now existed everywhere, and it showed their facility, their blind spot, their failure of control, and an inmate handing 4 other inmates a defeat that made the whole institution look like it had lost the room. Something had to be done about that, and the easiest thing to do was the thing that protected everyone who mattered and crushed the one man who did not. Owen Briggs went to Travis before the administration even finished its first phone call, and the 2 of them did what men in a corner do. They agreed on a story. In their version, there had been no ambush, no locked door, no broken camera left dark on purpose. In their version, Ryan Walker had lured 4 men into the shower room and attacked them without warning, an unprovoked assault by a dangerous prisoner with a violent history. Exactly the kind of thing the facility had been working hard to prevent. It was a clean lie because it fit the picture the world already half believed. He was a convict. He was a trained fighter. Of course he was dangerous. The 4 men he had dropped nursing bruised ribs and aching jaws were more than willing to read from the same page because the alternative was admitting they had been part of an ambush that failed. Travis fed them their lines, and Owen filed the report. And the machine that had ground Ryan down for a month now turned to grind him into something specific, a villain. They moved him to solitary that same night. The door of the segregation cell closed on him with a sound he felt in his teeth, and the small barred window let in nothing but a strip of corridor light. He sat on the concrete shelf that passed for a bed and understood exactly how completely the situation had turned against him. He had broken his own rule to stay alive, and staying alive had cost him everything the rule was meant to protect. The appeal that Claire Bennett was building, the slow, careful case that depended on him being a quiet, wronged man who had never raised his hand inside, was now buried under a video that the whole world had decided meant whatever it already believed. The administration's official story called him the aggressor. The public was split between calling him a hero and calling him exactly the violent criminal the original jury had seen. And there was no one left in Iron Ridge who would tell the truth, because the only witnesses were 4 men who had agreed to lie, and a guard who had built his career on looking away. Out beyond the fences, the footage kept spreading, and the version of Ryan Walker the world was deciding on hardened with every hour. A violent man in a violent place, getting what such men get. The truth of the broken camera and the locked door, and the men who came to break him, was a small, quiet thing, and it was being swallowed whole by a loud, convenient lie. Ryan lay back on the concrete and stared at the ceiling of the segregation cell, and for the first time since the verdict, he let himself feel the full weight of where he was. He had done the one thing he swore he would never do, and he had done it for the most justifiable reason a man could have, and it had not saved him. It had handed his enemies the very weapon they had been trying to make him hand them all along. The appeal felt impossibly far away now, a folder on a desk in a world that had already made up its mind. He had fought to stay alive, and in doing so, he had lost the one thing he had been protecting all along, and there was no one coming as far as he could see who could give it back to him. The video the administration wanted buried was the one thing they could not bury, because it was already everywhere. And a lawyer named Claire Bennett was watching it for the 4th time in a row in her small office 2 hours from Iron Ridge. She had Ryan Walker's appeal file open on the desk beside her laptop, the case that should never have convicted him, and now there was this, a 10-second clip the whole country was arguing about, showing her client doing the one thing he had sworn to her he would never do inside. But Claire did not see what the crowd saw. She had spent enough years in courtrooms to know that the loudest reading of a thing was rarely the true one. And the more she watched the footage, the more the official story stopped making sense. She watched the way the 4 men moved in spread out and patient the way men move when they are the hunters and not the hunted. She watched Ryan with his back to the wall boxed in waiting. And she watched what he did when it was over, crouching to check the men he had dropped, and she knew no aggressor in the world did that. The administration's report called Ryan the attacker, the one who lured 4 men into a room and assaulted them without warning. The video told a different story to anyone willing to look. Men did not wander into an ambush of their own making and end up surrounded 4 to 1 against a wall. The footage had a shape, and the shape contradicted the report, and the contradiction was the loose thread Claire Bennett began to pull. She filed for everything. She demanded the facility's incident logs, the disciplinary records, the maintenance reports, and most of all, the camera footage from the entire wing for the days surrounding the shower room. The administration resisted citing security, citing procedure, but the video was public, and the pressure was public with it, and a facility that has already lost control of one recording cannot easily pretend the others do not exist. The records came grudgingly, in boxes and files, and Claire went through them line by line. What she found was a pattern, and the pattern was the whole truth the official story had been built to hide. The maintenance logs showed the shower room camera had been reported broken for months, flagged and never repaired, a known dark spot that someone had chosen to leave dark. That single fact turned the administration's story inside out. The men who set the trap were the ones who needed a room with no eye. A man being lured there did not choose the place his attackers did, and they chose the one place where there would be nothing to see. The footage from the rest of the wing was worse for Travis Boone than anything Claire could have invented. The corridor cameras, the chow hall cameras, the yard cameras, all of them still working, had been quietly recording for the entire month Ryan spent in the block. And across those weeks of footage was a story no report had mentioned, a story of one man being systematically broken in plain sight while a guard looked the other way. There was Travis lifting the tray out of Ryan's hands in the chow line again and again on a dozen different days. There were the shoulder checks in the corridor, the crew crowding him during Count the Bunk, dragged into the hall. There was Ryan in frame after frame, standing with his arms down, while men shoved and spat and laughed, never once lifting a hand. The cameras the administration controlled had recorded the exact opposite of the story the administration was telling, and there in the edges of that footage was Owen Briggs, drifting away whenever Travis went to work, studying the far wall while the tray came out of Ryan's hands, walking out of frame at the precise moments a guard should have walked in. The cameras did not just exonerate Ryan. They convicted the two men who had built the lie frame by patient frame, and Claire Bennett laid it all out in order, like a hand of cards she had been waiting her whole career to play. The hearing that would decide Ryan's future was convened inside Iron Ridge, a disciplinary review, with the power to send him deeper into the system or pull him back from the edge. They brought him out of solitary for it, and he walked into the room thinner than he had been a month before, but with his back straight and his hands for once free. He did not yet know what Claire had found. He only knew she had asked him to trust her one more time, and that he had very little left to lose by doing it. The administration presented its story first smooth and rehearsed. Owen Briggs took his seat at the table and told the version he and Travis had agreed on: the unprovoked assault, the dangerous prisoner, the 4 victims. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who had filed false reports for nearly 20 years and never once been caught, and for a few minutes the room belonged to him. Then Claire Bennett stood, and she took it apart. She started with the maintenance logs holding them up, reading the dates the shower room camera had been reported broken and never fixed. The facility's own records, she said, show that the one room in this entire wing without a working camera was a known blind spot for months. The report claims my client lured 4 men into that room to attack them. But the man being lured doesn't pick the room. His attackers do. And they picked the only place in this wing where there would be no footage of what they intended to do to him. Owen shifted in his seat, and Claire moved before he could recover. She brought up the wing footage, weeks of it, and she did not summarize. She showed it. The tray coming out of Ryan's hands over and over. The shoulder checks, the crowding, the bunk in the hall. Frame after frame of a man absorbing punishment with his arms down, played in order across the screen, until the pattern was undeniable to everyone in the room. "This is the violent aggressor in your report," Claire said. "For 1 month on your own cameras, he never raised a hand. Not once. He was robbed, harassed, and humiliated daily, and he absorbed all of it. Does that look like a man who attacks without provocation? Or does it look like a man who endured everything he possibly could before 4 men locked him in the one room where no one would see what they did to him?" She turned to the technical part, then the part that mattered most, and she had brought in an analyst who knew the sport to walk the panel through the shower room video frame by frame. The 4 men had moved. First, the analyst explained, spreading into an attacking formation, and Ryan had stayed against the wall until the first punch was thrown. Every strike Ryan landed was a placed, controlled shot, the minimum force required to stop a threat, delivered by a man with the training to do far worse and the restraint not to. A man who wanted to hurt them could have armor, the analyst said. With his background, he could have ended any one of them permanently. Instead, every blow was calibrated, To disable, not to destroy. And when it was over, he checked their pulses. That is not the behavior of an aggressor. That is the behavior of a man defending his life and refusing even then to take more than he had to. The room had changed. Claire could feel it the way the weight shifts when a story everyone accepted starts to crack. She turned back to Owen Briggs, and she put the corridor footage back on the screen, the footage that showed him drifting away every time Travis went to work. "Officer Briggs," she said, "your report describes an unprovoked attack, but your own facility's cameras show you walking out of frame at the exact moments my client was being harassed day after day for a month. They show you doing nothing while a known blind spot went unrepaired. Either you failed to see a month of systematic abuse happening directly in front of you, or you chose not to. I'd invite you to tell the panel which it was." Owen had no story for that. The version he and Travis had built was a wall with one door, and Claire had just walked through it. He stammered something about the demands of the job, the difficulty of watching every inmate, but the footage on the screen behind him answered louder than he could, and the panel was no longer looking at him as a witness. They were looking at him as a problem. The truth came apart for Travis Boone in that same room, and it came apart fast. Faced with the wing footage, the maintenance logs, and the technical breakdown of the shower room video, the panel saw exactly what had happened: an orchestrated campaign of abuse that ended in an ambush and a cover story stitched together to hide both. The four men who had agreed to lie began to come apart, too, once it was clear the lie would not hold, each of them suddenly eager to explain that it had been Travis's idea, Travis's plan, Travis's room. The panel's findings were clean and complete. Ryan Walker had used the minimum force necessary to defend himself against a coordinated attack, and the charge against him for the shower room incident was dismissed in full. Travis Boone was referred for prosecution on new charges organizing the assault and orchestrating the campaign of abuse that the cameras had recorded in damning detail. And Owen Briggs, the guard, who had built a long, quiet career on the foundation of looking away, was terminated and referred for investigation into his cover-up and the years of arrangements that had preceded it. It did not end there, and that was the part Ryan had stopped letting himself hope for. Claire had never stopped working the original case underneath all of it: the warehouse, the missing shipment, the smooth manager named Dale Foster who had pointed the careful finger. The attention the video brought, the scrutiny that came down on Iron Ridge, spilled backward onto the conviction that had put him there, and a case no one had been willing to look at twice was suddenly being looked at, very closely indeed. The holes Claire had always known were there began to open. The financial trail that had been used to convict Ryan, examined again with fresh eyes and fresh pressure, pointed somewhere it had never been allowed to point, before back toward Dale Foster and the accounts he had actually controlled. The man who had built a wall around himself with a convenient scapegoat found the wall coming down because the scapegoat had become the most watched prisoner in the state, and no one builds a quiet frame around a man the whole country is watching. The wrongful conviction was reopened, investigated, and at last overturned. The case that should never have stuck came unstuck, and the truth Ryan had been waiting on through every flipped bunk and stolen letter and swallowed insult finally surfaced into the daylight. He had been right all along about one thing, the thing he had clung to on the worst nights in the worst cell. The truth had been there the whole time. It had only needed someone willing to dig for it, and a reason for the world to care. When they told him, Ryan did not celebrate. He sat very still in the small room where Claire delivered the news, and the hard composure that had been his armor for a month finally cracked just slightly around the eyes. He had walked into Iron Ridge with a rule and watched the rule fail him. Had broken it to stay alive and watched that nearly destroy him, and somewhere on the other side of all of it, the thing he had been fighting for had come back to him anyway, carried not by his fists, but by a woman who had simply refused to stop looking. The day they released him, the gate he had measured his whole sentence against finally opened in the direction he had stopped believing it could. He walked out of Iron Ridge, a free man, with his name returned to him, the champion who had been called a coward, and then a villain, and was, in the end, neither. The two crowds that had argued over the video fell mostly silent, because the truth, once it was all the way out, left very little to argue about. Marcus Hale was still inside when Ryan left, and the two men's eyes met one last time across the yard on the morning of his release. The old man gave him a small nod, and there was no "told you so" in it, only something closer to relief, the look of a man who had warned a younger one off a cliff and was glad for once to have been only half right. Ryan had not survived by becoming the man the block wanted him to be. He had survived by holding the line as long as a man could. And then, when there was no line left, by refusing to take more than the moment demanded. What Ryan did with his freedom said more about him than any of it. He could have walked away from fighting forever, buried the part of himself that had dropped 4 men in 10 seconds, and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he opened a boxing gym, and he opened its doors to the people most likely to be turned away from anywhere else. Men who had fallen the way he had fallen. Men with records and reputations, and too much anger, and nowhere safe to put it. He did not teach them to fight, not really. He taught them what he had spent his whole life learning, and one terrible month in Iron Ridge, relearning at the highest possible cost. He taught them control. He stood in the center of a ring that belonged to him now, watching men who reminded him of his worst days learn to measure their own strength, to hold a thing that could destroy and choose every single time not to. It was the only lesson he had ever truly known, and it was the one the world had nearly killed him for proving, because the truth Ryan Walker carried out of that prison was the same truth he had carried in, only now he had paid for every word of it. Real strength was never about beating another man. It lived in the harder thing, the thing no crowd cheered, and no camera caught the daily quiet work of holding back. The strongest man was not the one who threw the first punch. He was the one who fought only when there was no other choice left, and who even then took no more than was needed to survive. The man they had laughed at in the yard, the man Travis Boone had stood over to entertain a crowd, had been the strongest person in that prison the whole time. Not because of what his hands could do, though they could do a great deal. Because of what he refused to do with them for as long as a man possibly could, and because when he finally had no choice, he proved that the difference between a fighter and a brute was the only difference that had ever mattered. Ryan Walker walked out of Iron Ridge, having lost almost everything, and kept the one thing that made him who he was, and he spent the rest of his life teaching others how to keep it too.